Cause and Destiny of Crying and Laughing, Chapter 16, entrusted by Quan Mengu to be the bee and butterfly envoy to find an alliance in the old land. It is a commoner's friendship bit. He said that Jiashu took the note and looked at it carefully. He was very confused and didn't know who wrote it. The uncle and his wife at home don't have to do this, and the footman naturally doesn't dare. Look at the handwriting. It's very graceful, a bit like a woman's handwriting. If he, Lena, never came, how could there be another woman who could send this note in the middle of the night? Looking at the table again, I saw that the ink cartridge was not completely covered, and a writing brush without a cap had rolled onto the corner of the table. Thinking about it again, the windless movement on the plane trees in the courtyard just now became clearer. I thought to myself that on such a stormy night, it would be quite dangerous for people to jump over the wall and across the house. She jumped over walls and houses like this just to see what I was doing, which was quite touching. If she accepts it silently, her conscience will be troubled. What kind of expression should be made to her? But how should this expression be expressed? I couldn't help but feel deeply impressed by her kindness, but my temperament and hers were somewhat different, and there was nothing I could do about it. I went to bed and couldn't sleep, thinking about the angry things in a daze, like reading a random book, one paragraph here and one here. In the early morning of the next day, I suddenly felt dizzy. When I got up, I felt like I was wearing an iron hat, and my head was so heavy that I couldn't lift it up. I had to lie down again. As soon as he lay down, he suddenly became ill. I was sick for 2 days and never left the bedroom. In the afternoon of the next day, Helena learned the news and made a special trip to see the doctor. When she arrived at Tao's house, she didn't go to the upper room first, but went to Jiashu's house. Standing outside the door, she coughed twice, and then asked, "Is Mr. Fan at home?" Jiashu could hear clearly. It was he, Lena's voice, and she replied, "I'm sorry, I'm sick. I'm in bed." Helena smiled and said, "I knew you were sick, so I came here specifically to see you." As she spoke, she had already walked into the house. Coming, Jiashu was wearing short clothes, her feet were bare, and her head was propped up high on a pillow. There are more than a dozen books piled on the pillow, as well as some candy, wives, and pill packets. But among these things, there is another thing that is noteworthy, which are several photos with their backs facing out and face down, covering the pages of the book. Helena came in, her eyes flickering with light as she turned on the pages of the book. Jiashu didn't know it at first, but later he understood it, so he deliberately cleaned up the books, sandwiched the photo in the book, and put it aside together. He smiled and said, "I'm really disrespectful. I have no clothes on and no socks on." As he said that, he held the edge of the bed with both hands and stretched out his feet to put on his shoes. Helena suddenly stepped forward, stretched out her hands, and said, "Are we still polite?" When she said this, she originally wanted to hold Jiashu's shoulders to prevent him from standing up. Later, it suddenly occurred to me that this matter was a bit unreasonable. As soon as she hesitated, the two outstretched hands stopped. No longer able to reach forward, she only made a gesture of extending her hands a foot or two away from the edge of the bed and fell down, stunned. If Jiashu stood up, he would stand facing her. It was not good to sit still, so he had to smile and said, "It is better to obey orders than to be respectful, so I lie down." "Miss He, please sit down. I will tell them to sit down." Helena smiled and said, "I'm here to visit a doctor, but you want to help me?" Before Jiashu could answer, Mrs. Tao came in from outside. She said, "You are here to visit the patient sincerely, but he is making a fuss, shouldn't you? Don't be polite. No matter how polite you are, people will feel even more uneasy." Helena smiled and said, "It's time for Mrs. Tao to joke again." As she spoke, she took 2 steps back. Mrs. Tao held her hand with one hand and patted her shoulder with the other. She smiled slightly at her, but said nothing. But Helena said calmly, "Fan, why did your husband suddenly become ill? Want to see a doctor?" Mrs. Tao said, "I have long advised him to take a look. Besides, he is about to take the school entrance examination." Helena then pulled away Mrs. Tao's hands, took a few steps back, and while chatting, she turned over the book on the table. She only turned over 2 pages, but she found a note inside the page. It was, "Wind and rain deceive others. I advise you to cherish them." Under the big characters, there are 2 lines of small characters. "Falling flowers are intentional. Flowing water is ruthless, no matter what." The big characters and the small characters are clearly two kinds of handwriting, and the small characters can be seen to have been added by Jiashu. Without saying anything, I quietly held the writing paper in my hand and then slowly put it into my pocket. Since Mrs. Tao was in the house, it was not convenient for her to sit for long periods of time, so she advised Jiashu to go to the hospital to avoid getting seriously ill, so he and Mrs. Tao went to the bedroom. Jiashu also thought that he had to rush to take the exam. Don't delay. Just go and have a look. I thought that the Guan family was very careful about me, so I had to inform them. That night, when everyone was quiet, I got up and wrote a letter to Shofeng. After a while, Shugu's name was written on the envelope. After finishing the letter, I was tired enough, so I put the letter in a book on the table and went to bed. The next morning, before he woke up, Helena came to see him again and saw that he was sleeping soundly on the bed. Without being alarmed, she went to the table to open the ink cartridge and wanted to leave a note. Suddenly she saw the man with the note from yesterday. The book was still there, and I thought that there might be more than just this note in the book, and there might be other materials that could be found. So he turned the book over again, and with just one lift, the letter was revealed. The letter read, Miss Guan Shugu, number 20, Buddhist Temple Alley, adjacent to the back door, received the seal. When Helena saw it, her heart skipped a beat. She looked back at the family tree and found that she was still sleeping soundly. So I wrote down the address tightly in my heart, kept the letter in the book, and left the room without leaving a note. When Jiashu woke up, it was already 10 o'clock. He immediately went to the hospital and passed by the post office on the way to post the letter to Shugu. When I got to the hospital, I checked carefully and found that there was nothing serious. The doctor prescribed medication, but told him to go for walks in the park. He believed that he must be in a good environment and free his mind. I took this medicine today and will see you again tomorrow. Joshua was anxious to get better, so he naturally obeyed. This hospital is where Shofeng recuperated last time. The female nurse, who was a little short-sighted, came up to her and said with a smile, Mr. Fan, can the girl be in detention? Jiashu nodded. The female nurse asked, why don't you come with Miss Guan? Jiashu smiled and said, we don't see each other very often. In the afternoon of the next day, Jiashu went to the hospital for a follow-up visit. As soon as he entered the door, he saw the female nurse pointing here and saying, come here, come here. It turned out that Shugu was standing talking to her, asking if she was here. Coming. When Shugu saw her, she stopped talking to the female caregiver and came to greet her. When I looked at the family tree, I held the hat in my hand, revealing my messy hair and two high-arched cheekbones protruding from my face, which made me feel that the eye sockets above and the cheek flesh below were sunken. His face was as white as paper, with no blood at all. Only the light green chuluo gown he was wearing was fluttering and had no flesh on it, which made him look more and more skinny. Shugu said and said, I haven't seen you for a few days. Why are you so sick? You were caught in the rain that night and caught a cold. Jiashu said, I am very grateful to the eldest lady for taking care of you. Then she turned around and looked around, but saw no one, so she whispered, I have something important to ask of my uncle. I asked him to come here today, but he didn't come. Shugu pondered for a while and said, yes, if you have anything to say, tell me it's the same. Now the two of them walked to the corridor. Jiashu sat down on an open chair and said, my illness is a heart disease. He said coloringly, it's not any other heart disease. It's just that every night, I have terrible dreams. I dreamed that Feng Shi was being abused. I had another dream last night. I dreamed that she was tied to a pillar, with her short hair hanging over her face and mouth, and 7 or 8 soldiers surrounding her. A soldier whipped her with a cane whip. Her face was covered with tears, and she opened her mouth to cry for help. One of them pulled out a pistol and said to her, if you keep shouting, I'll beat you to death. When I woke up, I was covered in cold sweat and my clothes were soaked through. I thought that this matter might not be completely a dream. It would be best if I could find out some information about this matter. No one else is capable of this. Shugu smiled and said, Mr. Fan, how can you believe in dreams? You must know that she is very happy now, and there is no need for you to miss her. Jiashu said, even so, this is not the case. In reality, we don't know whether he was tortured or not. Besides, if I have this kind of nightmare for a whole day, there must be some reason for it. Shugu looked at him with such sorrow. Dao Mi Feng is almost compacted into one place. The anguish in his heart cannot be explained by words. He said, "Mr. Fan, please relax. I can discuss it with my father when I get back. Fortunately, he is familiar with the road, so it doesn't matter if he goes to see it again." Jiashu said with a smile, "That's great. When will you reply to my letter?" Shugu thought for a while and smiled and said, "You are not in good health, so naturally you are waiting for a reply within 3 days." She stood up, held her fists slightly, arched her hands towards Shugu, and said, "Excuse me, please." Although Shugu felt unfair in her heart, she couldn't bear to see his pitiful appearance. She accompanied him to register for a follow-up consultation and took him to the waiting room. When she saw him coming out of the consulting room, she asked him about the doctor. "No matter what, it doesn't matter." Jiashu smiled and said, "Look, I can still come all the way to the hospital for treatment. What's the big deal? But he always said that I was mentally stimulated, and that I should take a good rest and go to the park more." As he spoke, seeing that he was just panting, Shugu wanted to help him out and get in the car. However, she was not a new style woman and did not have the courage. She just followed the family tree closely and watched him get in the car and leave. "I just walked step by step next to the foot of the wall. I was thinking about General Liu's house. Letting my father go there last time was already a risk. There was no reason to let him go again now. But Mr. Fan saved my father's life, and now I see him suffering from such a serious illness. How can I ignore it? Let me first go to the front and back of Liu's house to see what it's like." So he decided to come to the Liu family. Shugu walked from the front door of Liu's house to the back of the house and looked around. Not only were there 4 people carrying broadswords at the gate, there were also 2 more carrying fast guns. In the long alley next to the house, at the T-shaped bend, a police post and a guard with a gun were added. It seemed that the Liu family knew something about what happened last time and was now on guard. According to this situation, this place is not risky. But if you can't get in, where can you find out about Feng Shi? There is only one way to find Feng Shi's mother. But where is her mother? Again, I don't know. A day without finding out any news about Feng Shi will make the family tree feel uneasy. Since he dreams about Feng Shi every day, maybe Feng Shi has really been abused. Look at that woman. She is not a dishonest person. She was deceived by Liu, and then used her power to oppress her. How could a teenage girl resist? If she really still has her heart for Mr. Fan, how grateful they should be to me if I bring them back together. Shugu just lowered her head and thought, not knowing where she had walked. When she suddenly looked up, she turned from the alley on the left of Liu's house to the alley on the right. After walking for a long time, I only made a big circle around other people's houses. There were 2 women walking in front of him. One was about 50 years old, and the other was only about 20. The old man said, "I think that master doesn't treat you well. He just dislikes your small feet." The young man said, "Forget it if you don't succeed. I think that master has a bad temper, and is difficult to take care of. But he is so big, young master. Why is my wife so young? I still doubt that she is a young lady." After hearing this, Shugu couldn't help but feel moved. Isn't she talking about the Liu family? The old man said again, "Sister Li, you go back to the store first. I have to go to the street to buy some things. See you later." After saying that, she slowly walked forward. Shugu understood at this point that the old woman was the one who introduced the helpers, and the young woman was staying in the small shop that introduced the helpers. Then he took 2 steps and followed the old woman, calling old lady from behind. Although the word old lady is a name used in Beijing for old women with good character, when the lower class hears it, they feel that the caller is very polite. So the old woman immediately turned around and asked, "You're a stranger to this girl. What's the matter?" Seeing a quiet alley next to her, Shugu led her into it and asked with a smile, "What I heard you and the sister-in-law talking about just now were talking about General Liu's house." The woman said, "Yes. What are you asking for?" Shugu smiled and said, "Since the sister-in-law didn't tell me, old lady, how about you introduce me to her?" The old woman looked at Shugu all over, smiled and said, "Girl, don't joke with me. With a person like you, you are going to work as a helper? Besides, anyone who comes for trouble in our store must tell us the details or find a guarantor before we dare to recommend them." Shugu touched her body, took out $2, and said with a smile, "I'm not going to help. To tell you the truth, I have a relative's girl who was abducted by a kidnapper. I'm asking around. It's said to be sold at Liu's house. I want to take a look, but I can't get in. If you pretend that I'm looking for trouble, bring me in and take a look. I'll give you 2 yuan to buy you some clothes. Clamp 2 smooth and round pieces of foreign money with 3 fingers, rubbing them together and making a rattling sound. The old woman looked at the foreign money, lifted up a corner of her clothes, wiped her hands, and said, "You only get 2 yuan for a trip. It's a good idea. But if you really meet that child and the child starts yelling, what should you do? Then, General Liu, you are not easy to mess with." Shugu said with a smile. That child was abducted when he was 3 years old. He is now 18 or 19 years old. How can he recognize me? I'm just going to take a look. Son, I don't recognize him either. The old woman stretched out her hand to get the foreign money and said with a smile, "All good things are done by people. I feel sorry for you. Let me take you there." Shugu pulled her hands into her arms and said with a smile, "What if they say I don't act like a mother?" The old woman smiled and said, "The old sisters who came out of the mansion were carrying clothes on their hands. There are plenty of Jinliuzi, but they are not as young as you. But the Liu family is looking for a young one, which is fine. If you want to go, let's go, and don't let the people in the store know." Shugu agreed when she saw her. "Just give her $2. The old woman also told Shugu to stop talking after entering the house and only act by looking at her eyes. So he led Shugu to Liu's house. Shugu just lowered her head and followed the old woman into the house. After being informed by the doorman, they walked all the way to the upper room. From a distance, they saw a Zhangfei couch placed in the corridor. Feng Shi, wearing a pink silk short dress and white satin slippers, leaned on the couch. In front of the couch was a small rosewood coffee table, on which were placed 2 large porcelain plates, piled up and down, with snow lotus roots, roses, grapes, apples, and jade bud pears. They were light red and tender green, and they looked good even if they were not eaten. There were many bonsais around the Zhangfei couch. Halfway through the night, the fragrant jade pearl orchids were emitting fragrance. The old woman saw Feng Shi, squatted down from a distance to greet her, and smiled. "Madam, don't you dislike people with small feet? I'll find you a big foot." Feng Shi raised her head and unexpectedly found Shugu. Her face immediately blushed. Shugu looked at her, stood behind the old woman, shook her hand, and slightly pointed her mouth towards the old woman. Feng Shi had stood up from the Zhangfei couch, but when he saw Shugu's situation, he sat down again calmly. It just so happened that General Liu came out without asking a word. When Shugu stole a glance at him, the short beard on his rough black face stood up. His yellow eyes looked at people like electric light. He was wearing a short silk shirt and trousers, with the sleeves rolled up above the elbows. He had one hand on his waist, and the other holding a big pear, biting the skin. Shugu didn't dare to look at him, so she lowered her head. He pointed at Shugu and said, "Is she here to work too?" The old woman squatted down and greeted General Liu, smiling. That's right, her mother worked in a general's house. She followed her mother to do fine work, and now she wants to find something for herself. She is a grown-up girl. Do you think it's okay? General Liu smiled and nodded, saying, "Why not? Let's go to work today. Our wife is young, so we should find a young person to serve her. This girl is not bad. What do you think?" When General Liu came out, Feng Shi stood up, took a bunch of grapes, and just picked them one by one, sucking the honey pulp into her mouth. After sucking one, she picked another. Her eyes only looked at the fruit plate, not daring to look at Shugu. When General Liu asked her what she was talking about, she replied, "It's up to you." General Liu laughed with his mouth open, walked over, stretched out his right hand, held Feng Shi's chin, and made Feng Shi raise her face. With his left hand, he pointed at Feng Shi and said, "Aren't you happy to find a pretty girl? Last year, I went to Shanghai and saw people hiring older girls to work, called big sisters. I was so envious. After returning to Beijing, I have been looking for one for a year, but still couldn't find one. Today, I really found one. Why shouldn't I use her? Not to mention that she is a human, even if she is a fox spirit. I have to use her." He pulled his hand back and clapped his hands. He said, "That won't work. You look angry. You have to be happy." As he said this, he looked at Feng Shi with his eyes sideways. Feng Shi really laughed at him. Shugu saw this and couldn't say anything, but she stood on the ground with her feet, wishing she could make a hole in the ground. General Liu said, "Hey, you can continue to work for me, girl. I'll give you 30 yuans a month. Do you think it's too little?" Seeing his expression, Shugu smiled slightly and said in a low voice, I have to go back to get my bedding today. Come to work tomorrow. General Liu took a step closer and said to her, don't be shy. Tell me what you want to say. Okay, I'll go to Tianjin tomorrow and come back the day after tomorrow. Don't quit just because you didn't see me. Don't listen to my young wife. She can't make the decision. Feng Shi held a snow pear in her hand, peeled it with a small knife with her back turned, and signaled Shugu with her eyes. Shugu understood, so she pulled the old woman's collar and came out together. The old woman walked to a remote alley, pulled up her collar, wiped the cold sweat on her forehead, and said, my God, I'm scared to death. This is really not a joke. Shugu smiled and turned back to go home. Shugu went home and told Shu Feng what happened. Shofeng smiled and said, of course. But when you leave, Liu and I will ask for help, and she will have to bear the consequences. Shugu was very happy to see her father agreed. The next morning, Shugu went to the hospital to see Jiashu first and told him the details. Jiashu forgot why and bowed deeply to Shugu 3 times. Shugu took 2 steps back and smiled, and said in a low voice, you are so polite. Jiashu said, I don't have time to write a letter. Please ask her carefully today. If she doesn't forget me, I ask her to take advantage of this opportunity today or tomorrow to find a place to talk to me. After saying that, he thought for a while and said, no, I'll write a few words to her. So he asked the hospital for a piece of paper, and with the fountain pen on him, he leaned over the backrest of a bench in the waiting room and wrote. But when he picked up the pen and wrote the 2 words Feng Shi first, he froze. What should he write next? There were many people in the waiting room, and he was afraid that if he was absent-minded, it would attract people's attention. So he wrote 8 words, I still treat you the same as before. After writing, he shook his head, put away the pen, crumpled the paper into a ball, and said to Shugu, I can't write, it's better for you to tell her. Shugu had no choice but to nod, got up and left. Jiashu chased out of the waiting room again and said to Shugu, you should take the letter with you. She can always tell that it is my handwriting. So he unfolded the paper ball, found a Western-style window, and added a line of words, the sad man is white. When Shugu saw him write these 4 words, his face turned pale. Shugu also felt that he was really sad, and she couldn't help feeling sad. She took the paper and stepped aside, saying, I'll call you when I have a chance. Shugu left the hospital in a hurry and went to General Liu's house. She told the gate that she was here for a trial job and ran straight to the upper room. There was another maid in the upper room who led her to Feng Shi's bedroom. When Feng Shi saw her, she said, the general has gone to Tianjin. I don't know what he has assigned you to do. You stay with me in my room today and do some small things. Shugu understood and agreed with a yes. When there was no one in the room, Feng Shi frowned and said, Sister, you are so brave. How dare you pretend to be someone looking for trouble and sneak here? If you are found out, I'm afraid your life will be in danger. Even I will be in trouble. Shugu smiled and said, yes, this is the general's house. It's not a joke. But there is another person whose life is in danger. I have to come here at the risk of my life. Why? Because he saved my father's life. I can't help but save his life. As Shugu spoke, her expression gradually turned grim. Finally, she frowned, hugged her knees with her hands, and sat on a chair aside. Feng Shi said, Sister, are you saying that I am ungrateful? I have no choice. How is Mr. Fan now? What's the point of him asking you to come? Shugu took out a note from her body and handed it to Feng Shi, saying, he asked me to bring you a letter. She told Feng Shi the situation. Feng Shi took a look at the note, quickly crumpled it into a ball, stuffed it into her pocket, and said, I know he can't forget me, but I'm married now. What else can I do? Just tell him that he thanks him for thinking of me. As for the kindness he showed me, I won't forget it either. To be honest, I have a convenient time now. I can take out 18,000. It's not worth much. I have something to thank him. Please take it for me. Shugu smiled and said, 18,000, that's 100,000, or 80,000. You can take it out. I knew it a long time ago. But he doesn't want you to thank him. He just wants you to cure his illness. Feng Shi said, I'm not a doctor. How can I cure his illness? Shugu said, you think he is sick. It's nothing but missing you. Now, you have 2 prescriptions to cure his illness. First, you take this opportunity to run away with him. Second, you tell him face to face that you don't love him anymore, and now you are living a good life. In this way, he will stop thinking about you and his illness will be cured. I can only say this when I send a message to others. Whatever you want to do, it's up to you. After saying that, his face became stern again. Feng Shi looked at Shu Gu's face and thought about her words. After a long while he said, okay, it doesn't matter if I meet him. My mother hasn't been feeling well these 2 days. Tomorrow morning, I will go home to see my mother, and I will sneak out through the back door to find a place to meet him. But if I meet someone, it will be a disaster. It's better to go to Zhongnington, where it's quiet in the morning, and ask him to wait for me there early in the morning. Shu Gu said, you can't break your promise if you promised. It doesn't matter if you don't go, but if you don't go, you will hurt him more. Feng Shi said, I will never break my promise. If you are worried, you can pretend to work for me for 2 days, and I will meet him tomorrow. If you don't want to do it, I will fire you. Shu Gu stood up, patted her chest, and said, okay, even if your general comes back, I am not afraid. So I asked Feng Shi to look after the servants at home, and took the opportunity to call Jiashu and asked him to wait for me under the cypress trees of Zhongnington early tomorrow morning. Jiashu was lying on the bed thinking, Shu Gu is a kind-hearted person, but she has heroic spirit. A girl can actually pretend to be a maid and visit the rich mansion. Her loyalty and courage are beyond reach. This kind of person is of course born with chivalry, but if she didn't have a special feeling for me, how could she be willing to do such a risky and suspicious thing? But she is so good to me, and I am always indifferent to her, which is inappropriate. This kind of person is honest and straightforward, which is desirable. Although she lacks some attitudes of new women, it is also in this aspect that her strengths can be shown. I still leave Feng Shi to cater to her. Just thinking about this, Shu Gu's call came, saying that Feng Shi had arranged to meet at Zhongnington early tomorrow morning. When Jiashu got the news, everything he had just thought of was completely overturned. He thought that Feng Shi was under surveillance by the armed forces, and she had asked me to meet at Zhongnington. It can be imagined that she had avoided the meeting at Shichahai that day out of necessity. Zhongnington was the place where Feng Shi and I had pledged our love, and now Feng Shi had arranged to meet at Zhongnington, which showed a lot of deep affection. She asked me to go there so early in the morning. Could it be that she wanted to reconcile? If we agreed, maybe she would follow me back tomorrow. Then, which direction should I escape to? If there really was such an opportunity, I would stop studying in Beijing and take her back to Hangzhou immediately. Judging from the situation, I am afraid that even if she was oppressed by force, she might not surrender. The more he thought about it, the more right it seemed. He even had no idea how to hire a car the next day, how to get to the train station, and how to get there. I wrote a letter on the train to inform Bohi and his wife that everything was planned. That evening, I planned to escape tomorrow. I knew I had to get up early tomorrow, so I went to bed early at 12 o'clock, so that I could get up early tomorrow. But after going to bed, I was so preoccupied with my worries that I fell asleep at 2 o'clock. When I woke up, I was surprised to see that it was bright outside. I quickly got dressed and got up. I turned on the light and saw that it was 2:15. I had only slept for 45 minutes and had not slept more. I lowered my head and looked out through the glass window. It turned out to be the light of the moon. It was still early for dawn. I fell asleep again, feeling dazed, as if I was at Zhongnington on the train or by the West Lake. I woke up with a start. It was only 4 o'clock. Why did I wake up so easily? It was inexplicable. I thought about it. It's time to sleep, sit down and rest. The days are still long and the nights are short in early autumn. At 5 o'clock, it's dawn. No one will get up at this time. Jiashu went to the kitchen to scoop some cold water to wash his face, then quietly went to the gatehouse, woke up the waiter, and told him that he would go to the park to breathe fresh air at dawn according to the doctor's advice. He asked him to open the door, hired a rickshaw, and went straight to the Zhongnington. At this time, the sun had just risen from the top of the cypress forest in the east of the Temple of Heaven, shining yellow on the green reeds. Jiashu remembered that the last time he came here, the green reeds here were only a few inches long, and the flat fields were green, which looked a bit like the early spring in the south of the Yangtze River. Now the green reeds are 4 or 5 feet deep. Several roads outside the altar are immersed in the green reeds. The wind blows the long reeds in patches, one after another, forming layers of green waves. The scattered old cypresses are all standing in the green waves, which is a bit different from the last time he and Feng Shi were here. After getting off the car and entering the inner altar gate, the sun was still on the treetops, not yet shining on the ground. The main road under Berlin was particularly gloomy. The sounds here were particularly quiet. Looking at the red walls of the ancient temple hidden in the trees from outside, it seemed to make the air here more quiet. A magpie flew to Joshu's head, stepped on a dead branch, and fell down with a puff, breaking the silence in Berlin. Joshu followed the road, bypassed a tea shed that had not yet opened its doors, and walked to a stone bench on the other side of the ancient temple. This was the place where Fengxi burst into tears when he explained that he had helped Fengxi last time. Everything was the same, except that the shadow of the sun was reflected in the west corner of the temple, slightly tilted to the north, which indicated that the time sequence was different. Joshu thought that when Fengxi came here, she would definitely remember the engagement that morning. Remembering what happened that morning, she would certainly find this place, so he sat down on the stone bench and waited for Fengxi to come. But although I insisted on waiting here quietly, my eyes could not help but look around. After looking around, my body could not help but stand up and wander around. In this cypress forest, the grass on the ground was shaggy and grew 1 or 2 feet deep. The summer insects were now old and chirping in the deep grass. There was no human figure or voice around. Just as I was hesitating, I suddenly heard a rustling sound behind me. I saw a person walking out of the bushes, holding a flowery paper umbrella in his hand, covering half of his head, wearing a blue bamboo cloth flag shirt, and stepping out of the grass with white socks and white cloth shoes. Although Joshu knew that this was a woman, this kind of clothing did not look like Fengxi now, so he did not dare to go forward and talk. When she closed the umbrella, although she was still wearing a pair of black crystal glasses on her face, it was undoubtedly Fengxi. He hurried forward, held her hand, and said, "I really didn't expect that I would have such a tragic change when I returned to the south." In one breath, Joshu took her umbrella and put it on the stone table, let her sit on the stone bench, and asked, "Do you still remember this place?" Fengxi nodded. Joshu said, "Don't be sad. I completely understand your affairs. Don't look at other things, just look at the clothes you are wearing now, which are the ones we used to wear together, which shows that you are not the kind of person who only seeks wealth and fame. You still remember the old cloth clothes, and of course you will remember the friends you made when you wore cloth clothes. You cried out of joy here, and now I see you like this. I am so happy that I am going to cry too." As he said, he took out a handkerchief and wiped his eyes. Fengxi wanted to say the words, but because of his praise, she held back what she wanted to say. Joshu said, "People say you've changed your mind, but I don't believe it. Seeing you today, I guessed it right, which shows that our relationship is different. Why don't you say anything? Hurry up and tell me. I've prepared everything. As long as you can leave right away, we'll go to the station right away. There's a train to Puku at 10 o'clock today. Let's go." Joshu said these words and finally forced Fengxi to say what he was talking about. I'll tell you what he was talking about next time. Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.